Scope in JavaScript and why it matters. So scope can be thought of as at any given line of code in your program, what data or what variables, what values can you access at that given line of code? For example, if you have some variable in your program called YouTube channel at line 5 in your program, can you access that variable? If yes, then that variable is within the scope of that line of your program. And we'll go through plenty of examples later and explain some of the nuances with scope in JavaScript, but you can think of it as at any given line of code, what data do you have access to? And generally, scope can kind of fall into two different categories here. So lexical scope and dynamic scope. Lexical scope is defined by where something is written determines its scope. So where your code is written determines the scope, and typically a parser will go through and create these scopes before it actually executes your program. It kind of gets your program ready and sets up these scopes and then executes your program. And this is JavaScript. JavaScript is a lexically scoped language, meaning where you write your code determines the scope. To whereas in a dynamically scoped language, where you call your functions, that determines the scope. So the scope is determined at execution time. But JavaScript is a lexically scoped language. Now, why is scope important? Why does it matter? Well, in programming, it's usually good practice to keep your data least accessible as possible. Meaning your data is only accessible where it's actually needed to be accessible. So when I say data, I'm talking about your variables, your functions, objects, different things like that. As if it's only accessible in that one place, it's going to make your code easier to reason about because you're not having to worry about everything in your program. You're just focusing on one individual component of your program or one individual piece of your program. You don't need to worry about accidentally mutating state in other parts of your program because you know that data is only relevant right there where you're working on it. Okay, so that's also going to help make your programs more extensible, more maintainable. It's going to prevent bugs. It's going to prevent certain name collisions. So if you create a variable called YouTube channel here in this file, it's not going to have a name collision with YouTube channel in some other file. It's going to help prevent those sorts of bugs and make your programs much more easy to reason about, extensible, maintainable, and generally help you create better programs. And not only that, but scope is going to allow you to determine what data you have access to while you're writing your functions and while you're writing your program. So a very important concept to understand when developing in general and especially in JavaScript. So within JavaScript, it can kind of be thought of as having three different kinds of scope. And this is different from the two overall categories of scope, but within JavaScript's lexically scoped language, you can think of JavaScript having a global scope, a function scope, as well as a block scope. When looking at this example here, I have this function called new scope, but on the outside of this function on line 18, I'm console logging an array.isArray method call, passing in an empty array. And as you can see on this line, I never create an object called array in my program. I don't import it. I don't have this anywhere in my program. This is just given to me automatically by JavaScript. In the JavaScript runtime, I can access this array object and call its isArray method on this object. And this is available to me within my global scope. As you can see, this is not within any function, but you can kind of think of JavaScript as if it's within the global scope, it's within the global function. I find that makes things kind of easier to reason about, as the global function, it's still going to have a call stack and its own execution context and thread of execution. So that makes sense to me. But if something is not within a function or blocks, it's within its global scope. So this array object is given to us automatically within JavaScript's global scope. Same with this console object. We're accessing the log method on the console object here, but I don't create this console object anywhere in my program. It is given to me automatically by JavaScript within JavaScript's global scope, as this isn't within a function or a block. But as we move down here, we see I create a function, new scope, and then within this function's curly braces here, it's going to create an entirely different scope within this function, meaning it could declare the same variables as what we have in this global scope, and there's not going to be a name collision. Those variables or that data is going to be specific to this function within these curly braces. And then within that, I have a while loop, and within these curly braces, it's going to create a whole new block scope within those curly braces to where I can declare data within these curly braces, and it's going to be specific to this block of code. And one important thing to know with while loops is that this is only going to apply to const and let variables. And you can watch my video on variables for a more in-depth discussion on those. But const and let are block scoped, to whereas var declarations are going to be function scoped. So if we were just using var, this block here, this while loop, would not create an entirely different scope. var would just be function scoped. But with let and const, anything within curly braces is going to create a new scope. So while loops, for loops, different things like that are going to create its new scope for let and const variables. So we have this global scope here. Functions create a new scope, and then blocks also create their new scope when using let and const. Okay. So moving on here, let me show you a couple of examples here. So what I have going on here is in my outer global scope, I've defined a variable, a constant called best channel, and I've assigned it to the value of code Ryan. And then I define a function, best channel function, and I declare another constant called the same name as my global scope, best channel, but I give it a new value, code Joe. And then I console log that out, and then I console log this outside function, and then I just make sure to run this best channel function so we can see what it does. And then if I go ahead and run this here, you can see that this compiles, and this is totally valid JavaScript. And I do get a different value for my global scope and my function scope here, because this function has its completely new scope compared to this outer global scope. So I can have the same name of a constant within both scopes, and it's not going to have a name collision here. It's not going to accidentally mutate this value. If everything was globally scoped, when I reassign best channel to code Joe here, then this value would get changed here as well. But since these have two different scopes, that doesn't take place. And this is totally valid JavaScript. These both have two different scopes. This is sometimes called shadowing, when an inner scope has the same variable name as its outer scope. But this is valid JavaScript to do. Now, I probably wouldn't do this too much in general within the same file, having the same names in your outer and inner scopes, as that can make things a little bit trickier to reason about within our programs. But this does go to show that this function creates its entirely different scope than the global scope. All right. Now, moving on from this, one thing that's important to know about scopes is that when JavaScript doesn't see a certain variable within its scope that you're trying to access, so you're trying to find a certain variable within a scope, and JavaScript doesn't see it within that specific scope, JavaScript will say, okay, well, let's look up to different scopes and see if that variable exists. Because you can, within a certain scope, you can still access data within outer scopes, but it is a one-way street. In inner scopes, those scopes can only look outside. So an inner scope can see values and data within outer scopes, but it doesn't work the other way around. outer scopes cannot see values within inner scopes. Okay, so I'll run through some examples so this makes more sense. But like I said, it's a one-way street. You can only look to outer scopes. This is sometimes called looking up the scope chain. So if you have an inner scope nested within several outer scopes, well, that inner scope, if it doesn't see the value you're trying to reference, it will then look up a scope. If it doesn't see it in that scope, it will look up another scope, and it will keep kind of climbing the scope chain until it finds the value or it doesn't. And then you'll get likely an error as you're trying to reference some variable that doesn't exist. Okay. So looking at this example here, I have created a global constant called language, and I have given it the string value of JavaScript. And then I create this while block, and then I try to console log the language variable. But as you can see within this while block, I don't declare the language variable again in this while block, within the scope of this while block. But just as I said, within a nested scope, an inner scope, JavaScript will look up the scope chain to its outer scope and see, okay, does this exist in our outer scope? So it's first going to check this while loop scope. It doesn't see it. Then it's going to look to this outer scope. And as we can see, it still finds it. It still console logs that outer scope. Now, does this work in reverse? What if I switch this around? What if I declare the language within my while block, and then I try to console log it in my global scope? Now, I'm going to actually put this line of code here below the while block as, okay, we definitely, by the time we hit this line of code, we have declared this language variable, but it is within a kind of child scope, within a nested scope compared to where I try to reference it here. And like I said, scopes are a one-way street. When it hits this line of code, it's not going to start looking within scopes. So because of that, you're going to see I get an error. Language is not defined. It doesn't find this value, this variable, within its scope. It can try to look up scopes, but it's already in the global scope. And since it's a one-way street, it's not going to look down into the scope and find the language variable. Okay, so scopes are a one-way street. Inner scopes can look to outer, but not vice versa. All right, so like I said, cannot look down the scope chain into the while loop that has its own scope. So in summary here, scope is at any given line of code, what variables or what values do you have access to? In general, in programming, there's a couple of different kinds of scope. Lexical scope, meaning where something is written, defines its scope, and dynamic scope, where something is called, defines its scope. And in JavaScript, it is a lexically scoped language. So in those examples there, you could see that where I wrote that while loop created the scope within those curly braces, or where I created those functions created the scope within the curly braces of those functions. It didn't matter where I called that function, whether I called that function in some other file or even in some other program. That function scope was determined where I wrote that function and within the curly braces of that function. And then scope is important because it prevents name collisions. It makes things easier to reason about. It keeps your data more co-located to where you actually need to use that data and generally creates more extensible, maintainable programs. JavaScript can be thought of as having three different kinds of scope: global scope, function scoped, and then block scopes with let and const variable declarations. And then one key thing to remember is that when JavaScript doesn't see some variable you're trying to access within its kind of current scope, it will look to outer scopes to see if it has access to that variable. And it will keep climbing the scope chain, climbing up to more and more parent scopes until it hits the global scope. If it doesn't find it, it will throw an error. You're trying to reference some value that doesn't exist. But it doesn't work the other way around. It doesn't look into child scopes to see if something exists, only into parent scopes. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you want to see my video on variables in JavaScript, you can check that out in the card right here. And then if not, I have videos coming on closure coming up that ties nicely into this scope discussion and other kind of more advanced topics as well. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in that next one.